Way Home would like to acknowledge the original stewards of whose lands this podcast is recorded on. In York Region, we recognize we're on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, and that this is the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit. In Vancouver, we acknowledge that we are on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, whose presence on these lands continue to this day.
Welcome, friends. Hello, Housers, to another episode of On the Way Home. I am your host, Michael Braithwaite from Blue Door, a very cool organization in the north of the GTA. We work in primarily York Region, Peel Region, and a little bit in Durham Region right now. Blue Door as an organization is focused on preventing and ending homelessness. We do that through emergency housing, transitional housing, long-term housing, housing for 2S LGBTQ plus youth. We also have a construction social enterprise and all sorts of wraparound services for people across a region of 1.1 million that desperately needs the support going towards our most vulnerable. We do this in partnership with the amazing folks of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. Tim Richter and his team are doing great stuff. They've got their conference set for Halifax in the fall of 2023. You should register for it. Registration is open. It is the best conference of its kind. Amazing speakers, amazing presentations from your peers, from people all over the world. Great keynote speakers. You know, if you haven't been before, sign up, check it out. Halifax, of course, beautiful place to go in the fall. I'll be there. I hope you'll join me. Go to cah.ca to register and check out all the other things they're doing too. Things like becoming a Built for Zero community. And trust me, your community wants to be a Built for Zero community. They do all sorts of trainings. And if you want to find out more, go to caeh.ca. If you want to find out more about what we're doing at Blue Door, perhaps you're saying, hey, I'd love to develop a construct, which is our social enterprise, our construction social enterprise. Go to bluedoor.ca. And check us out. We'd be happy to have that conversation. I'm so glad you joined me today. I think quite often right now when we talk about homelessness, housing is the main focus, and it should be. We need deeply affordable housing, and we need lots of it. But part of the challenge too revolves around income. For many of the people we serve at Blue Door and across the country, the 235,000+ Canadians experiencing homelessness, if they actually had an adequate income and some supports and some wraparound supports, they could afford the housing that's out there. And so we have to have that discussion. When we talk about food banks, you've heard our guest, Neil Hetherington from Daily Bread, often say it's not about adding more food banks. That's not the solution. We need greater incomes. We need affordable housing so people can afford their food. In Ontario right now, if you receive social assistance, it's $720 a month. And the average one-bedroom apartment is about $2,000 a month. So there's a huge gap. So we need to talk about income. Government needs to address income. Now, here's the challenge. We've heard a lot about a basic income, and it's very cool. And I think we need to have that discussion. So I was really happy today to welcome a guest. We have David Green, who's a professor at UBC. He's a professor at the Vancouver School of Economics. And just a really cool guy. He was pulled into a panel a few years back in Vancouver when the the British Columbian government, the NDP government, had a minority government. They worked together, and the Greens said, hey, if we're going to work together, we need to look at the basic income. So they pulled together this panel of experts to take a look at, like, what the heck does that actually mean? And they did all sorts of research from across Canada, around the world. They put together this 500-page report. And it was pretty cool stuff. Like, so they actually looked at basic income, what it meant, is it the right tool moving forward? And then from there, they actually said, this is great. We don't want this to sit on a shelf. What can we do with this? And they approached a group in Montreal, a publisher, and were able to publish this book with the hopes of kind of moving that discussion forward. And so we have a great discussion around why maybe just one kind of basic income for all might not be the answer, and that there's a lot of different pieces to that, different supports that have to be added for people to be successful moving forward. We talk about how people have responded to the book and the report. He talks about within minutes of that 500-page report landing, before anyone can really read it, he was, as someone told him, he was brain dead in a message. So some people really embraced it, others have not. But it really, there's some great suggestions in this book to move that discussion forward. And we talk about how we need to be more solutions focused when going to government to move things forward and dig us out of this crisis. And we talk about that and much, much more. I hope you enjoy this conversation, this important conversation, as much as I did. Here we go. David, so glad to have you here. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk.
We ask the same question to all our guests because it's very personal and different for every guest. And that question is simply, what does home mean to you?
What does home? I think home means family, honestly. Home means wherever my wife and my children are, but it's probably a broader definition that includes my brothers. And so I have a pretty broad notion of home, I'd say.
No, I love that. I love that. Family means so much. And actually, it's interesting. I think for sometimes when we think, if we look up the Webster definition, they'll talk about the four walls and a roof. But rarely do we have a guess that that's how they describe home. It's usually around family, safety, where I feel I could be myself and that kind of thing. We like to learn a little bit about our guests. And I was hoping you could talk just a little bit about your journey, your pathway into the work you're doing now.
Sure. So I'm a labor economist. So that means, for the most part, I study things like wages. I spent a lot of time studying inequality, some amount of thinking about how technology affects the labor market, and then on how policies can affect those kinds of outcomes. A couple of years ago, I guess in 2018, I got a call from the BC government saying that they wanted to set up this panel on basic income. And I sort of jumped at the idea to try to look into what is, one of the more interesting policy options that's on the table and being actively discussed. And partly I jumped at the opportunity because the other people on the panel, Reese Kesselman and Lindsay Tedds, are people I have a lot of respect for. So it seemed like a great opportunity to get to work with them. And I really actually kind of came to it with an open mind, thinking this is an interesting option. Let's see what we can find out about it. We were given quite a bit of resources and time, and produced a report that talks exactly about that. So I sort of came to it not as an expert in basic income in any way, but rather as a person with a deep interest in labor markets and labor market policy.
Very, very cool. And so, on this show, where we focus a lot on housing, poverty, homelessness, health, and those types of things, we often talk about much of the situation we find ourselves in now is due to a failure of policy and bad policy. So great to have your expertise here. We want to talk about the book, Basic Income and a Just Society, Policy Choices for Canada's Social Safety Net. And we want to talk about that today. And it's so interesting to have you on, and very relevant for me. I was in a meeting just yesterday where someone from the federal government, we were talking about the housing affordability crisis and how to work through it. And someone from the federal government, when I said, well, we can't really have a conversation about that if we don't talk about income. And he said, this is not an income issue. He said, most of us, more income's not going to make a. And in my head, I didn't get a chance. There's a big group to retort. I thought, we're not talking about most of us. We're talking about people with a lack of income. And I think quite often Canadians hear the term basic income. They don't quite know what it means. It's been thrown forward. I think, politicians, government has an interest, but it would be very expensive to do. And what does it really mean? And so I kind of set that up as, let's talk about your book. If you could give us a little bit of background, how it kind of came to fruition. You talked a little bit about that, maybe the process of putting it all together, and how it came to be. That would be fantastic.
Sure. In some ways, it came from a sort of an interesting point, which is in BC, a few years back now, there was an NDP government elected, but it was a minority government and needed the Greens to stay alive. And the Greens said, well, in return for our support, we want a basic income pilot run. But soon after that election was settled and they got together and talked, they decided they didn't really know, what a basic income even really meant, and how could they run a pilot if they didn't know what the pilot was for. And so instead they decided to create a panel, which was us. And I always like to say, one of the great benefits for us was it wasn't clear that the Greens and the NDP knew whether they would agree on a basic income. And so therefore, from both of their perspectives, sort of politically, it was better to give us a lot of rope and a lot of time and have us not report back too soon. So they gave us a couple of years, good resources, access to excellent data. And we used those resources to go out and commission reports from over 40 different reports, actually, that you can find on the website that we created afterwards, which is called bcbasicincomepanel.ca. And all of those reports are up there. Part of our goal was whatever conclusion we're going to come to, we want it to be the case that the resources that we create can be there for other people to tap into as they discuss these issues, as you were saying. So a big part of the report was actually trying to characterize all the problems with the existing system so that we could understand where a basic income would slot in. In the end, we created a report. It was 500 pages long, presented it to all different parts of government because our argument was that you need to look beyond income, that exactly as you were saying before, all of these things intertwine: housing, health, the labor market in particular, all intertwine. And so the scope of what we did is actually quite broad. Then we were a little worried that it would end up sort of just sitting on the government shelf. We've had discussions with them since. I think it's actually having some impact inside the BC government, but we were worried that it wouldn't in a longer term sense, and that people outside BC might be interested. And so we contacted the IRPP in Montreal, and they were willing to help us turn it into a book, to sort of take that 500 pages and craft it better in a more readable sense, I hope, with particularly the editing skills of France Saint-Hilaire, who works at IRPP, helping us take sort of 4 or 5 voices and turn it into something that's more like one. And that's what we've put out there now. And I think it's important to note that part of the book is about not just a basic income, but setting out a framework for thinking about how to think about policy, how to think about big changes in policy that we hope will have sort of resonance beyond just the basic income issue.
Yes, and we actually I want to get into that as well. What are the recommendations coming out in doing all this work, 500 pages, and doing all the work? Were there any surprises? Anything that going in you thought might be one way, and then doing the work you thought, wow, I didn't know?
One of the ones, although I had some inkling, but it became more apparent as we got into it, was the impact on work. So paid work. Let me be clear. Paid work. One of the big things that's often thrown up against basic income is a claim that a bunch of people will withdraw from paid work and the economy will be in big trouble. And essentially, we put a bunch of work into trying to analyze that and came to the conclusion, which a lot of basic income proponents say, that in fact, that's not a margin on which you would decide this, that essentially the impact, our predictions of the impact on work are not, that it would not be a huge impact. There would be some amount of withdrawal from paid labor, but a lot of that is related to, say, people with young children. And I think from a societal point of view, we would say that's probably a good trade-off. But even those are not huge changes. So, the extent to which it really wasn't going to do that was probably a big point that came out.
Yeah, and that makes total sense. Now, I think one of the pushbacks too, and you talk about this, it's talked about it in the book, is that when people think of basic income, it's that kind of broad strokes of one solution for all. And I know in the book you say that can't be. I'm wondering if you could just kind of expand on that as well. When you looked at this, you can't just say, here's a basic income, and that works for everyone, right? There needs to be kind of a different approach.
Yeah. And I think the right way to think about it is, as you well know, I think as probably everybody listening knows, the issues that we're talking about are very, very much multifaceted. The example that I always like to think about is youth aging out of foster care, who are a particularly vulnerable group. When you go through and sort of document what happens with these young people, it's just heartbreaking, right? So in BC, there's about 1,000 youth aging out of care every year, which makes up about 2%, a little less than 2% of their birth year. But they make up 15% of deaths between age 15 and 34. So it's just shocking. And I think this is a good example where you think, okay, one of the things that these young people need is income, no question. Like an income support is needed, but you don't want to end there at all, right? A lot of what we're talking about people who've gone through trauma pretty much by definition. They don't, by and large, have an attachment to adults who can support them when they make the mistakes we all make when we're 19 years old. And so our argument was a complete notion of how to help in this area has a basic income in a sense, like an income support for them in part, but it also has a building of community. And by the way, about 60% of youth aging out of care in BC are Indigenous. So this has a big element of reconciliation with it. So you want to think about how do we build and support community that they can keep coming back to and find support in. You also need to think about the labor market. How do we make sure that there are, good jobs for them and for everybody, but, as opposed to pushing them out into the labor market, wishing them well with gig kind of jobs. So we kind of argue that, truly tackling an issue like this is very multifaceted, that if you focus too much just on the income one, there's a real risk that sort of takes all the oxygen out of the room, that people say, oh, we've given them an income. We wash our hands of this. We're good to go now. And that's one of our real concerns with the basic income. I should say the other thing that I think is important is, so previously, sorry, a lot of these references are BC relevant, but previously before, so the government has made a bunch of changes recently with youth aging out of care that are quite good. But the previous system was one where essentially at about age 18 or 19, you gave the youth a bunch of training in how to be independent. So essentially how to do budgeting, how to shop for your food, things like that. And then at 19, you sort of wished them well and pushed them out into the world. And if they didn't have income, you gave them income assistance. And that's a very individualistic approach. It puts all of the weight on their shoulders. And part of our argument in this book is a basic income in general is a very individualistic approach. It in principle can hit a lot of targets because you're giving people money and telling them go work on whatever target matters to you. But our argument is that a lot of the solutions are actually very much community-based. And so you want to think about policy options that build community. And that sort of, like I say, in the youth aging out of care, part of that was purposeful resources put into helping build communities in which the youth have a say and in which they find support.
That's so interesting, the youth piece too. So I work at an organization called Blue Door in the Northern GTA, and we were working and are working on with Away Home Canada and the Observatory on Homelessness. We wanted to do a actual income pilot for youth, like a cash transfer pilot with them. And I know similar work I think has been done or is being done right now in New York City. I think something happened in Chicago where they did a little work around that, and it was specifically around youth leaving care. So yeah, it's so interesting to hear that. I know also, I mean, you talk a lot about BC, but there's a lot of great work happening there, and it's a case study for so many of us. I even know we were chatting with For Social Change, who did some great work around, it wasn't basic income, but it was For Social Change did a small project in Vancouver where they gave people, I think, $7,500, people who were not, say, high acuity. And they noted the changes, and it was incredible just for that little limited amount of money, that how their lives changed, right? So just showing that it for so many, it is an income piece. And if you with supports, they were already getting the supports, but with the addition of that income, it was just such a change. Now you made some recommendations and some policy. You kind of referred to them early on. You're proposing setting some policy reforms. I'm wondering if you could touch on some of those that have come out of the book.
Sure. I think there's part of what we do in the book is try to develop, and what we did in the report was develop a set of principles for thinking about evaluating justice-based policy and helping guide exactly the kind of policy options that we put on the table. And a big point of what we talked about was that you want to root these decisions in some notion of justice. We didn't want to impose one notion of justice, and so we essentially argue that most ideas of justice are based in an idea that people should get an equal basis of respect, that we build a society of equal respect. That then, in our mind, leads to a set of principles, and those principles then lead to the recommendations. Sorry, this is sort of roundabout. The principles include one key one is adequacy, and that comes back to what you're talking about in the sort of northern GTA with the youth, that the payments that are out there right now are not adequate. A really good example of that is people living with disability. We have these elaborate systems to decide whether a person has a long-term disability, and then once they're given that categorization, they're told, well, the income that we're going to give you for the rest of your life is going to be below the poverty line, and that sort of makes no sense to us. So, one part of it, and one big part of our recommendations was getting numbers up. That even if you don't change the system, that you get the benefits to livable levels. A second is, as I said, a real emphasis on respect, and that a lot of people find their notions of respect in work of various kinds, not necessarily paid work. And so then we put a lot of emphasis on developing a sort of work assist program that would be voluntary. So, for example, when we talked, and we did a bunch of consultations with different groups, but when we talked with people from the community of people living with disabilities, there a lot of emphasis, a lot of times came back to them. The system is set up to punish me for doing any kind of work. I can't even volunteer without feeling like I'm going to lose my benefits. The interesting thing was we are at the same time talking to the people in the government, and they said, oh, no, that's not true. We don't have rules like that. But no question the people living with disability felt that was the case. And so part of our recommendations is to set up a system that really integrates options for work and support for work, and allowing people to move on and off benefits easily so that they can take up work options in order to sort of gain that sort of feeling of self-efficacy, as well as the income stuff, but probably more importantly, the self-efficacy part. One of the other big areas for us, as I've sort of alluded to a few times, is the labor market. There's a lot of concern about precarious work, about gig work. I mean, really, our analysis says the amount of gig work is not huge. It really is mostly Uber, honestly, strangely enough, and Uber food and things like that. But what really is big and concerning is what's sometimes called fissured work. That is, those situations that where somebody, say like a really good example was long-term care homes that we saw during COVID, during the first part of COVID, right? Which was that a bunch of the people working as caregivers in those homes didn't work for the homes. They worked for some agency that farmed them out. And that has real implications for wage levels. It has real implications for whether the regulations that really should apply to them actually do apply to them. And so a bunch of our recommendations were around, let's take a clear-headed and conscious approach to regulating labor markets, making sure that we know who's an employee under the law, and having a real conversation with employers and employees to try to find the kinds of work arrangements that we want that are respectful. That also recognize employers need to, make decisions at work. Like, they need to be able to tell an employee what to do. It can't all be one way, but we feel like the balance was off. And so a bunch of our recommendations were related to that. Those are some of the biggest ones. We also, some of the other things that we've sort of seen come up in a lot of the income assistance systems in Canada, there are essentially in-kind benefits, that is, say, like dental benefits, for example, that people get while they're on benefit, but when they leave benefit, they either lose those immediately or sort of in a gradual way. And so we argued for a universal dental program, which of course is happening at the national level. I don't think they heard what we said at all. I don't think we could even vaguely claim credit for that, but it was something the BC government was very interested in. And so essentially creating a set of those kinds of supports that, again, make it easier to move on and off the income support when it's needed, but also make sure that we're supporting people at a broader level. And let me say the other two things running throughout this are these sort of two big principles. One is build community, and that I referred to already. We have a number of places where that comes up in very explicitly in our recommendations. The second is process. If you put a lot of emphasis on respect, that means you need to build a policy process that has real respect built into it. And the example that we had in front of us for this was the National Housing Strategy at the federal level, where you create an ombudsperson and a committee that is, or a council that provides recommendations, writes reports in the area, and those reports are by mandate read out in Parliament so that everybody hears them, so that the people who are affected feel they have a voice. And so the issue is to build a policy process that doesn't sort of from on high design a policy and walk away from it, or even in that process consult with the people most affected, often somewhat briefly, and then put it in place and then hope it runs, but rather a process where the policy is continually reevaluated. There's a place for real voice for the people who are affected. A policy process, honestly, that's sort of much messier than what we see now. And partly because we believe in that, in the book, we don't say, oh, here's a complete package. Here's the set of policies you need to do. But rather we say, here's some suggestions. And then by our notion, what we would hope would happen is you set out with those suggestions and you get a lot of input from the people most affected and then proceed down the path where that leads, rather than, saying, here's a sort of complete policy package.
Well, amazing. Yeah. And great to have that input. So you've done all this work. The book is launched. What has the response been from the public, from government, and others?
Well, let's see. It's been varied, honestly. So from government, it was quite good. We went around and our recommendations touched on about 6 ministries. We went and talked to the minister in each one of those areas, laying out our thoughts of how to proceed. And for some of those ministries, we've been in touch since, and they've, we've gotten feedback from them. Then in the public, I think in some sense you have to sort of, in my mind at least, you divide the world into two parts. One is people who really, really actively and passionately believe in a basic income. And I respect that passion. We set out being very interested in this policy option. We still believe, income is a key part of what has to be done. We just don't believe everything should be centered on a basic income. But the responses we got from parts of the basic income community were sort of interesting, might be the good way to put it. So we ended up with what I came to think of as the Wizard of Oz options. We were either the Tin Man had no heart and didn't understand, what really, we were just heartless. Didn't understand that this was a crisis in many regards, which it is. Or the Scarecrow, we had no brain and didn't understand. We couldn't actually analyze what was in front of us. Or we were the Cowardly Lion, which meant that we really actually did believe everything. We understood what happened, but we were too cowardly to actually stand up and say the thing that ought to be said. We sort of viewed ourselves as Dorothy. We were sort of setting off on the path and trying to find out which way it went. But I can tell you that 5 minutes after we released the report, and remember I told you this is a 500-page report, less than 5 minutes afterwards, I got an email from somebody, which is the subject line was, in all caps, was, "You are brain dead." And so that was one part of the response.
It's a fast reader.
Yeah, he's a very fast reader. Exactly. Yeah, I'm not even sure you could read the abstract that fast. But anyway, so on the other side, there's people who have a view that sort of is more like where we landed, and they are, they're quite supportive. And then our hope is now we're sort of interested in what's going to happen with the book. And again, like I said, we view the book much like the website as trying to put resources and research out there as a basis for discussion. And my hope is that people who don't know which side they're on, to some degree, come to this book, learn things, and then think about how to proceed. And let me also say, I also hope we've tried to write the book as a not as a which side is you're on sort of thing, as a, like, obviously it's either all basic income or not at all basic income. but rather we're all searching for the same goal here. We're trying to create a more just society. Here's some ideas about how to proceed, and perhaps not loading everything onto one policy tool is kind of our suggestion, but we completely respect, the viewpoint of the people who think that is the way to go.
Well, I think the book's very solution based, right? I mean, I think quite often we get government at the table and tell them everything that's wrong, but we don't really bring them tangible solutions, right? They're saying, hey, listen, we don't have all the answers because we were voted in. We're looking to the experts, and I think there's some great input here and some great paths forward. We often on this show talk about the income piece. We've had Neil Hetherington, a friend of mine, and he runs Daily Bread. And he talked about, listen, the answer is not more food banks. It's we have an income problem. If people can afford their housing, then they can afford food, to buy their own food. And in fact, during the pandemic, food bank usage was at its lowest because people had an income where they could afford food, right? Yeah. So it's, income definitely plays a part. I mean, it is more complex than that. And I think you've done a great job, you and the team, of just showing that and demonstrating that and giving some suggestions on how we can keep moving this discussion forward. Is fantastic. If people want to buy the book, take a look, find out more about the work you're doing, where can they go? Where can they get the book?
The book is put out by McGill Queen's Press, so that would be the place you could go. I think you can get it on Amazon. People have different opinions on whether they think Amazon is a good place to go for anything. So I'm a little hesitant to push the Amazon angle, but McGill Queen's Press is the place that you would go to find it.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for your work on this. Thanks for educating myself and our listeners. I think the basic income discussion or income discussion is not going to go away anytime soon. We can't let it go away. We know income plays a huge part, that they're inadequate. In Ontario, social assistance is $720 a month. And that is actually lower than it was in 1995 when there was a 21% cut to it, and it's never rebounded. So you can imagine when if you're looking at 30% of your income that should go towards housing as the benchmark right now in the GTA, and I'm sure same or similar in Vancouver, in most parts of BC, it's $100,000 a year of household income. That one needs not $8,000. You're getting social assistance. So the gap is huge. We need solutions moving forward, and this, I think, contributes to that conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciated the opportunity, and I enjoyed the discussion.
Amazing. I hope everyone goes out, buy the book, share the book, and let's keep the discussion going forward. David, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate it.